Hello, my name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University. I would like to begin today by acknowledging that the land on which I am speaking to you is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. On behalf of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson and our co-sponsors for today's events, the Edmonton Public Library, the Milton Public Library, the Thunder Bay Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library, I want to welcome you to the 7th in the Center for Free Expression's In Conversation series, which features prominent guests discussing issues important in the current political moment, in which democracy is under threat, public discourse on vital matters is fragmented into self-affirming bubbles, and when not discouraged altogether, I guess, and censorship is increasingly seen as an ally rather than an impediment to social justice. Today, we are looking at comedy, which is often a center of debate about the limits of freedom of expression. Comedy isn't just a bit of fun. Comedy is an essential feature in every society. It enables us to cope better with the serious problems, follies, disappointments, and challenges of our lives. As one commentator has noted, we laugh most readily around those things that in other ways are very distressing. A good joke almost invariably has a relationship with darkness, anxiety, and pain. The title for today's conversation is Comedy, Free Expression, and Social Justice. Our conversation today features Charlie Demers. Charlie is a comedian, voice actor, and writer based in Vancouver. One of the most frequently appearing performers on CBC Radio's The Debaters, Charlie also stars in the Emmy-winning Netflix animated series Beat Bugs and The Last Kids on Earth. The author of several works of fiction, nonfiction, and theater, Charlie is editor-curator of Robin Egg Books, a literary humor imprint at Arsenal Pulp Press. His 2017 release, Fatherland, from 604 Records, was nominated for the Juno Award for the Best Comedy Album. Because of his long commitment to West Coast labor, anti-war, and other social justice movements, Charlie's comedy has often been featured at progressive gatherings, as well as in clubs, bars, and theaters across Canada. It is great to have you with us today, Charlie.
Thanks very much for having me.
We are pleased that Charlie will be in conversation with Tara Henley. Tara is a Toronto writer and broadcaster. Over the past 2 decades, her work has appeared on CBC Radio and CBC Television, and in The Guardian, the LA Times, the Toronto Star, the Walrus, as well as dozens of other publications across Canada and around the world. Tara currently works as a producer and book columnist at CBC Radio and is a regular contributor to the book section of the Globe and Mail. She is author of the national bestseller, Lean Out, a meditation on the madness of modern life. Welcome, Tara.
Hi, thank you for having me.
In terms of today's program, after about 45 to 55 minutes of conversation with Charlie, Tara will turn to the audience to bring you into the conversation. As you listen to their conversation, if you have a question at any point that you'd like them to address when we come to that part of the program, please click on the Q&A tab that you see down at the bottom of your screen at any time. So just click on that tab and write down your question as you think of it. And then we'll get to it when Tara and Charlie turn to the audience later in the discussion. Now it's time to hear from the two of you. Go ahead, please.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, and thank you to the Center for hosting this and for its commitment to hosting difficult and challenging conversations. I'm Charlie. I'm very excited to speak with you today, and I'd like to start for the audience, just giving them a little bit of context about how you and I know each other. So I'm going to take it back to the moment that you and I met 21 years ago. So for listeners, it was at Simon Fraser University. I had just begun my master's degree, and I was sitting in my office. I was a TA, and I was reading The Peak, the student newspaper where Charlie was employed. And he wrote a hilarious comedy column called Thank You, Screw You. And I was sitting in my office, and I found it so funny and so politically smart that I closed the paper and I went down to the Peak's office and I said, can you give me an assignment? I have to be involved. And that was the start of a long friendship and also the start of my career as a journalist. So thank you, Charlie.
I love that story and have tried to cite it as legal precedent for getting a portion of Tara's paychecks, thus far to no avail. But the arc of the justice bend, the arc of the universe bends towards justice. Hopefully, I will get what I'm owed. It's such a pleasure to be here. I do want to start by thanking the Center for having me, and also to say that I am beaming in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm in East Vancouver, and not far from where we worked at the student newspaper, where the Thank You, Screw You column was. At one point, we were worried that our student newspaper was controlling the outcome of reality around the world. So the newspaper would go to press on Friday, print over the weekend, and come out on Monday. And there was one instantiation of the column that had a screw you to Dave Thomas, the founder of Wendy's. And I can't remember what the substance of it was. All I do remember was that Dave Thomas was alive when we wrote that on Friday and died either Saturday or Sunday, and was not among the living on Monday when the newspaper came out and said, "Screw you, Dave Thomas," recently deceased Dave Thomas. And the only other example of that was that we did an issue with a cover story on the history of violent political protest that came out on September 10th, 2001. And of course,
Yes,
it was
the timing.
Yeah. Somehow we did not get visited by anyone from CSIS or anybody but yeah, it was, those were heady days. I'm often very grateful that our student press times were not in the era of social media and the global international glare on the inner workings of the undergraduate mind. I was not doing my master's at the time. I was doing a BA, and but they were very special times, and I look back on them with a lot of fondness.
As do I. I wanted to start today by talking about the three concepts in the title: comedy, social justice, and free expression. All of those terms have evolved a lot, particularly in recent years. Let's hear your thoughts on all three of those concepts as we are now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to note about all three of them is that they are, to a certain extent, contested. They're contested terms. One of the sort of interesting things about maybe I'll start with free expression. One of the interesting sort of turns in progressive or left-oriented or left-identifying political language over the course of the last and please, for those in the audience, don't let my haircut fool you. I am of the left. This was a clipper accident over the course of the weekend. I am not an envoy of Steve Bannon. One of the turns that the language of free expression has taken on the progressive side of the political spectrum is a really unexpected turn to the language of property rights that's very much associated with the ideology of the political center and the political right. So that a lot of the language you hear is about, oh, you're allowed to say what you want, and the government can't put you in jail, but your employer can fire you. Your contracts can be canceled. All of those things are fair game, which may be true in a sort of contractual libertarian view of free expression, but I think of free expression more as a kind of not only set of sort of political and legal norms, but also to a certain extent cultural norms, which will always be more fluid. They'll always be harder to pin down. They'll always be contextually relevant, and they'll always come down to a certain extent to questions of taste, and personal values, and so free expression is, I mean, fundamentally, it's the ability to say, draw, write, sing, etc., what one thinks or what one wants to say. And crucially, I think that also means questions. That also means laying out the things that one isn't totally certain about and wants to sort of put forward, not in any kind of definitive way, but in experimental ways. So I think free expression is a term that has been contracted in both senses of the term, rendered smaller and reduced to contract in a way that I think has narrowed the conversation. And I don't purport to have the kind of the nuance or the sort of sophistication necessary to speak to the legal questions of hate speech and I mean, obviously those are questions that I sort of defer to a certain extent, as much as it's responsible in a democratic society to defer to the experts on certain questions. But I think we're talking in the main, in the sort of majority of cases about a culture of being able to say or express what one wants to without undue adverse consequences. That's not to say no consequence, but without disproportionate or obliterating consequence.
So that concept has changed, but the left, social justice has also changed.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think social justice in a lot of people's usage of the term in the sort of contemporary internet jargon has really become a euphemism for a sort of academically inflected politeness, as much as it means anything that we associate with the phrase historically, right? Social justice, to me, is a program of meeting out at the social level the sort of visions of justice that are articulated in the philosophical and spiritual and otherwise human traditions that address themselves to equality of condition, ensuring that people are, broadly speaking, have what they need to survive, to thrive, to conditions of peace, equality, the dignity of the human person and the dignity of human communities. So I think that social justice is I mean, it does involve being spoken of in ways that address human dignity and human worth, which I think has been the real focus in the last few years when we use the term social justice. But social justice also means the term social justice, I don't think can be reconciled with a stagnation in real wages for 40 years, or the fact that you can't drink the water out of every tap running in a country. Like those are social justice questions. So I think that the internet has this flattening effect where everything takes on its rhetorical as opposed to its sort of material or embodied quality. And I think that social justice has been also reduced to a kind of conversational quality as opposed to a sort of way of describing political programs.
And given these two trends that you're observing, where does that leave comedy?
So comedy is the one that's, I mean, tough to describe because it's so much a part of our daily lives. It's something that everyone feels that they have a certain mastery of, if not as someone who can do comedy or be funny, then at least as someone who experiences it from the audience perspective. Everyone likes to, I think George Carlin said, everyone loves to say that they're a klutz and that they're bad at math, and no one wants to say they're a bad driver or that they have a bad sense of humor. That this is just something that like everyone wants to believe they know what's funny. But these great sort of thinkers have wrestled with what it is that makes us laugh, what it is that is funny about things, and there's a certain consensus, but there are no catch-all theories. A few years ago, I guess this is maybe 10, 15 years ago, some archaeologists found what some piece of proto paper or whatever, maybe it was some sort of cuneiform like tablet, that it was being reported as the very first joke. And I think it was in Sumerian, and the joke was about an old man with a young wife, and she sat on his lap and farted. And like the fact that was in the first joke, like those kind of recognizable elements of the kind of bawdiness, the bathroom humor, the incongruity, and the ages of the couple, like all of these sort of ingredients that are so present in a joke that you would see on a sitcom made in 2020 are speaks to just kind of how sort of primal so much of comedy is for human beings. I mean, the big theories of comedy, for Kant, it was a resolution, a dissipation of tension into nothingness. So Kant believed that laughter was essentially the building up of a feeling of tension, of anxiety, and then a release of that tension, which we see in comedy all the time. And it's one of the reasons why comedians always go to these very dangerous and uncomfortable places, because you're trying to make the audience feel uncomfortable just to the point of unbearability, and then releasing that tension. And that release of tension is this deep pleasure. Molière, the French playwright, believed that comedy was primarily about incongruity, put two things that don't belong together together. That's really that's probably the biggest label. That's the theory of comedy that seems to explain the majority of what we find funny. And both of those explanations seem to also have kind of neurobiological explanations as well, of like laughter as a way of signaling to those around us that what we thought was a danger is actually not a danger. So relax. You think that there's a bear out in the woods, but then it turns out to just be a bunny in the bushes, and the incongruity between the bear and the bunny is funny. It's a release. You laugh. Everybody knows that everything's okay. That's not my theory. That's something I picked up along the way. And then there's Freud's theory, which is that it's essentially sublimated aggression. And this is the thing that I think a lot of people are at this particular political moment feeling very uncomfortable with, is this idea that essentially comedy is a way of carrying out a violence against someone in a way that is violence by other means, or aggression by other means, enforcing out-group and in-group superiority and inferiority. And those, I would say, are like three of the sort of big tent defining ideas of kind of what's at work in a piece of comedy, generally speaking.
And I want to go back to that last point in a moment, but the tension release thing really struck me. I mean, one of the things I've really missed this year not being in the newsroom is the sort of gallows humor that you have in the newsroom. It's such a release. You do a very difficult interview and then you're able to laugh about something else.
Yeah.
And 2021 and well, in 2020, I mean, very, very, very difficult time for so many of us. Times when we would normally really want to laugh. And yet it was one of the most humorless years that I can recall in my adult life. Why do you think?
It's such a good point, and it's such a good question. And even when Jim was setting up the talk, and I was thinking of a moment that, the way that it helps us to cope with these things, and cope almost has that like people talk about comedy as though, like almost like an opioid, like it helps people. And to a certain extent, I think it is. Sometimes it can be used just to numb the pain in a way that leads to nihilism. Sometimes, though, it can be used to numb the pain in the way of an anesthetic. Like it numbs the pain so that you can actually bear to get in and do the hard work that would otherwise be impossible to do. Next week is the 30th anniversary of the night my mother died, and on the 20th anniversary, we sort of got together, my aunts and uncles and cousins, and the night it happened, I thought I would be comforted to be surrounded by my family, and I was inconsolable. I couldn't stop crying, and I went upstairs in my aunt's townhouse, and my brother came upstairs, and he was trying to, zero me in, and he just kind of said, like, look, we're surrounded by all of our family, all of our loved ones, and then he says, he tripped on his words. He says, and they're all here tonight to celebrate Mom's death. And I lost it for 5 minutes. I could not stop laughing. Like, he meant to commemorate Mom's death or to remember Mom or celebrate Mom. But the way he said it, he said, they're here to celebrate Mom's death, like she was Stalin or something. Like, and I could not stop laughing. And it saved me that night. Like, it was the thing that made me able to go downstairs, see my family, be there, be present to them. And I mean, part of what's going on with 2020 and now 2021 is that there just hasn't been release of tension. Like if we're in the Kantian version of comedy, the tension is all still building. Like there is no release into nothingness. Or to go with the, bear in the bushes turns out to be a bunny. 2020 was like, you think there's a bear in the bushes, but it's a tank. The bushes rustle and out comes the Soviet army. Like so I feel like that's part of it. I don't think it's just that people have suddenly become dour and humorless and puritanical. But then there are other things as well they're at work in just the way that we get together, the way that we experience things. If you go to a comedy club, which you can't right now and don't, it's not safe. And but once you can again, notice, or if you have, think back to when you were there. How is it set up? The comedian is on stage, all the light is on them, and the audience is in darkness. And the audience is in darkness, not just to draw attention to the comedian, but the audience is in darkness to give them plausible deniability, right? So that if the comedian tells a joke about having diarrhea or getting sexually aroused by a commercial for an antidepressant or some totally inappropriate, shameful thing that you can't admit to, but illicitly relate to and think is hilarious, you can laugh in the undifferentiated, hidden mass of the audience. You're in darkness, you're hidden, your reaction is hidden, except that you join the rest of the audience in this sort of auditory response of laughter. But you have the plausible deniability of it. Not so in the era of Twitter and Facebook, right? Where your face, your avatar, your name, whether you fave something, whether you like something, everything you're being asked to respond to is in the full glare of the public, of public perception and public judgment. And so that inclination, that gallows humor that you reference, right? Because newsrooms are totally like that. I mean, I worked in a newsroom 10 years ago when we were doing a comedy show for City TV in Vancouver, the Vancouver affiliate. And the way people would talk, you think like, what has happened to your humanity, right? But that is actually the way they keep that humanity alive, is by protecting that little piece. But if you were to remove it from that context, it would be ghoulish, right? But what does the internet do but remove all context, right? When Ta-Nehisi Coates got off of Twitter, he said, he was having an argument with Cornel West and was getting bombarded by neo-Nazis. Like, tell me, under what circumstances would it be constructive for a debate between two African-American political, literary, intellectual figures like Cornel West and Ta-Nehisi Coates to be having a debate that Nazis are invited to? But that's what the internet does. It liquidates context.
And that moment, I mean, when you're talking about how humor makes certain things bearable with that release, I also think that humor gives us into a window sometimes into a way of understanding something that we've not had before. And I think a lot about Zadie Smith's book, Changing My Mind, and how I've had moments with comedy of having my mind change in a way that a polemic never could or would.
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing that people really struggle. One of the things that people really struggle with about comedy, because one of the things that comedy does, as opposed to other forms of rhetoric, is that comedy actually forces you to share the point of view of the person who's telling the joke. Otherwise, the joke doesn't make sense. Like, and then this is why it's so powerful, and this is why it can be so insidious. So, we use it. Take an example that will hopefully be, value neutral enough to illustrate the point without, being unnecessarily inflammatory or whatever. So an episode of The Simpsons where the movie industry comes to Springfield to film the Radioactive Man movie, and Homer goes to the set, and he has a competition with a teamster to see who can be lazier and more surly, right? And so the teamster is like, relaxing harder than Homer. And so Homer gets into this like basically battle of the laziness with this union film set worker, right? If I just say craft union workers are lazy and entitled and they don't work and they just show up to collect a check, you will just identify me as someone who is making a polemical, rhetorical point that you can accept or reject. If, though, I show you a cartoon where this character who is funny and hilarious is having a competition with a teamster over who can be lazier, we're taking as given that teamsters are lazy and surly. Now the question is the joke funny? And if you're laughing, then you have accepted, at least for the duration of that joke, my premise that teamsters are lazy and surly. So that's the thing about, that's the thing that was so powerful about a figure like Richard Pryor breaking through in a, people talk about the male gaze, right? And the male gaze is one of those terms that just got immediately bastardized. Like it doesn't mean what it, but the originator of the term, and I forget her name. I think it's Laura Mulvaney or
yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
But the male gaze isn't men looking at women. It's that the perspective of the male is the presumed perspective, and that even female audience members are made to gaze as though men, right? As though male. And the revolutionary thing about somebody like Richard Pryor or Eddie Murphy was, or later Chris Rock or Wanda Sykes, was that they came along in a major sort of commercially successful breakthrough way. So in ways that meant that they were getting through to a very large white audience in North America, and forcing the Black gaze, at least temporarily, onto that audience in order to appreciate the joke. Because it's like, here's the invitation to the party. Richard Pryor is funny. There's no denying it. There's no getting around it. It's an objective thing. There's a charisma to that. People are drawn to people who are funny. If you want to come to the party, the rhetorical or intellectual price of admission is that you will inhabit the perspective that the comedian invites you to in order for the jokes to work. And you and I have talked about Chappelle's show, and like at the height of the sort of Bush 2 war on terror, back when cancel culture was a right-wing white evangelical phenomenon, directed against the Dixie Chicks. It was this uncompromising forcing of these people's, these suburban people's kids to to inhabit a perspective other than their own in order to be in on the joke.
Mm. So given that power, circling back to the Freudian view of it, then how do we deal with that then?
I mean, I think that's a billion-dollar question that I don't purport to have an easy answer for. And I want to be clear that I think a certain amount of the increased sensitivity, maybe even the majority of the increased sensitivity of recent years and decades, has been for the good. And there, I think a lot of that gets lost, and that even among the many of the comedians who are sort of openly critical of, and I mean, I'm in an interesting place on this because, you know, my political commitments as someone of the left chronologically precede, if not ontologically precede or morally precede, but certainly chronologically precede my becoming part of the comedy industry. Like I was a committed organizational member of the left before I was ever a stand-up comic. And like, you know, my wife and I were on the Seriously Free Speech Committee. This is probably about, 12, 13 years ago. Mordecai Greenberg, a Jewish Palestine solidarity activist, a lifelong communist, was being sued in a slap suit by CanWest Global for a parody issue of the Vancouver Sun, going after its coverage of the Israel-Palestine question. This was an issue that he didn't even produce. He distributed copies of it. He didn't make the he didn't even make the parody paper. He was being sued by CanWest Global. There was not one figure from the world of, none of the sort of people who became the champions of. So I'm always quite leery of these people who free speech only became a question once it's about the right of a white comic to use the N-word, or people want to be able to use hateful language. I feel like anything that I say on this, I do want to kind of couch in that context. On the other hand, there are writers who would say, like, well, sublimated violence is better than violence. That's one thing, that is part of the that is a move in a more civilized direction. That the move into a kind of and I'm not totally sold on that view, but I'm also not completely aware, even from my point of view, like how I think my left-wing comedy affects my left-wing commitments in the real world. Like, I don't really know how the one turns into the other. We all kind of have this sort of magic theory of, like, somehow the jokes become the real world version of the thing that's said on stage. But I don't really know what the answer is, because you can't ask audiences just not to weigh in if they're pissed off about something, if they don't like something, because that's also clamping down on free speech, right? At the same time, we have social media corporations whose algorithms have made proportionality impossible. So you can't have the conversation at the reasonable level.
Hmm.
Like, so if something is being talked about, it's the only thing being talked about all around the continent for 3 hours. And then it disappears. And so, and that's also not a good way to have these conversations. So, I mean, that was a really long way of saying I kind of don't know. I don't really know how to. My own personal view is, I think, unworkable, which is that I hope that the internet as a space becomes, and I don't mean like streaming movies and you know, using Google Maps to get around. I mean, that's obviously a permanent part of the infrastructure of our lives now. But I mean, this kind of living on Twitter or chat room life as life. My hope is that that just becomes a more specialized thing again, as it was in the 90s and early 21st century, the aughts. I don't know how practical a hope that is. My dream is always that we'll treat the internet the way kind of mid 20th century culture treated the car, where like everybody gets a car and then it's like, okay, now we need movie theaters where you stay in your car and restaurants where you stay in your car because we never want to leave our cars. And then you kind of go, okay, we get it. Now we can get out of our car. Like, you know, we have it for a few years. My hope is that that's what will happen with the internet. Yeah. And then maybe the pandemic will be like, you know, like when your dad catches you smoking a cigarette and says, oh, okay, you want to smoke cigarettes, and then makes you smoke a cigar.
Yeah.
That's what the pandemic's going to be like. You want to live online? Okay, we'll see how you like living online. And I don't know.
Oh my goodness. Well, you know, the Twitter conversation is another whole aspect of all of this, and an important one. I will say to the audience, we are gearing up now to start taking questions. So we'll cover off one or two more points, but please do get your questions in. On the Twitter point, I did want to say that, you know, it is interesting reporting in that you do sort of get the sense of those of us who live in the sort of Twitter world are kind of absorbing a very different culture than, you know, a lot of people that I speak to for stories out in the world. You know, a recent example of that, I was, and this is not reporting, this is a friend. I had just been working on the piece that I reported out for the Globe and Mail on cancel culture. And I told a friend, oh, this is what I'm working on. And she said, oh, cancel culture. So that's when flaky people ditch plans all the time.
Yeah.
Like there is a gap between the very online and what our concerns are, and then, you know, the mainstream population and what people are thinking about, and, you know, and talking about and finding funny there. So that's one point I would make. And then the last point I wanted us to address is that is the issue of, I mean, the sort of end game of the road that we are on right now is, you know, what happens in comedy clubs when there's applause for political points, but not necessarily laughs. And I was speaking in that same piece that I worked on for the Globe. I interviewed Camille Foster, who's a podcaster, media entrepreneur, and we were talking about what makes comedy work. And he was saying, you need this element of surprise. And in order for surprise, you have to be able to transgress. You have to be able to shock a little bit. You have to be able to say something that has a little bit of truth maybe, but is a bit shocking on the other hand, and that the surprise is what makes it work, and that you can't have surprise if there is sort of this consensus, this morality consensus that we're all living in right now. What are your thoughts on that?
So those are two great and I think very, very intertwined questions. Because a friend of mine sent me and I mean the polling is this is the polling on whatever people want to, whether the term is political correctness or woke, and people have I've actually read very interesting distinctions between those two phrases and or terms, which I think are actually useful to distinguish between. And but that the polling shows that these are for the most part, like in terms of the popularity of these inclinations, like well out of proportion to the role they play in defining the sort of media sphere. or the culture, whatever you want to call it. But a friend of mine sent me a piece of reporting on a survey that actually, and what I loved about this was that it was so, it just shows how sophisticated people are, but it showed that respondents distinguished between the level of sensitive language they wanted from political leaders and from comedians. And there was a huge difference between those numbers. So not even like talking to different people and getting different answers, talking to the same group of people and understanding that it's one thing to expect of your premier or your prime minister or the the head of a university or the head of a large hospital or something like that, to expect them to use a certain level of sensitivity and attunement and awareness in their language is possible and applaudable, and applaudable is certainly not a word, but a good thing is what I'm trying to say in the most pretentious possible language. And versus a comedian who the number was much lower in terms of what they wanted. I don't have the numbers immediately to hand, but much lower in terms of what they wanted, which is one of those things that's like surprising at first blush. And then if you give it even 10 seconds thought, you're like, of course people feel that way. Why would anyone want a uniform level of like, I want the same amount of rectitude and sensitivity from like the Sunday morning pulpit or the Friday afternoon mosque to the comedy club on Saturday night, or like when I'm watching streaming some stand-up or sketch clip on YouTube. Like, of course no one feels that way. So there is that distinction. There's also the distinction between like the number of people who are on Twitter, and then within the number of people on Twitter, the total discrepancy between active users and non-active users. And the numbers on that are very consistent, that, you know, something like, you know, it's like the world's economic distribution is reproduced in tweets, where like 10% of users are responsible for like 90% of tweets. Like it's completely skewed. And I can say this as somebody who's now, I've been off of Facebook for about 4 years, and I've been off Twitter for I think 2 or 3 years, and I got off Instagram in the summer. If no one catches you up on certain things, like if you don't have someone who is your like social media interpreter who like lets you know, like a correspondent from that world who's like letting you know what's going on, you miss this stuff entirely. And unless, I mean, now conventional media has realized that these are click producing stories that they can run as though they're newsworthy events on the front page of the BBC website or on the front page of other national broadcasters, and you know, it's a completely different world. In terms of that need to transgress, or the need to shock, which is really just in some ways another way of coming at the Kantian analysis of comedy as a creation of tension. I think that it also speaks to something that Dave Chappelle said in relation to the free speech conversation, which is, he said, talked about reckless speech. And this is people are real. I mean, it's an uncomfortable phrase to sit with, right? Because I think a lot of us, what we're being asked to do is to think of the consequences of our actions and the consequences of our speech as an action. And I don't think that's an entirely incorrect thing. I think it needs to sit next to the 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 project of comedy in the aggregate, which is not only to make a particular joke or make a particular thing funny, but also to introduce a bit of daylight between human existence itself and our sense of seriousness about it. So comedians are not just making a joke about the weather or birthday parties or the prime minister, or the census, or traffic. They're making individual jokes about all of those things, but in the aggregate, they're making jokes about the human condition. And there has to be a willingness to be able to hold certain elements of ourselves, including our suffering, at a certain remove, at least temporarily, in order to allow for that existential perspective. Now, where that becomes very morally entangled is when you're talking about someone else's suffering. And what people want is like, I read a piece in the Atlantic this week about pandemic measures, right? And one of the problems is people want to be told 6 feet. You need exactly 6 feet between you and the other person. And so then they can go, okay, good. So that means at 7 feet, I'm safe, right? Or you can be in a restaurant for 15 minutes. And that means at 16 minutes, it's dangerous, right? It's like, no, it's not 6 feet. It's not 15 minutes. And similarly, there aren't exact, totally followable prescriptions for how you talk about human suffering in comedy. And it can't all just be autobiographical. So these are thorny questions that it would be totally disingenuous of me to say I have any easy prescription for, except that we have to be open to at least a certain kind of process of experimentation and a certain willingness to hear from the audience whether they like it or not. And that needs to be kind of felt out in an organic way. And the problem is people treat Twitter as though that's the organic way, as though the public is finally getting its say on things,
right?
Which is nonsense. Twitter is not organic. It is the for-profit, algorithmically driven, predatory platform of a privately owned software, company that for years was Donald Trump's biggest partner and rode both sides of that wave as long as it could. And this idea that what we're seeing on the internet is just the natural, organic, this is the people finally responding. That's also an idea that just has to be gotten beyond as well.
And I think that's why the format for working through a lot of these issues, conversation is such a powerful format, because for us in an hour, we can go into a lot of these sort of tense areas and try to unpack things a little bit. And that obviously you can't do that in a tweet. You just can't. You don't have the space or the breadth or the emotional airtime to really get into these kinds of conversations. So I think that's why the format of face-to-face conversation is so powerful, and that is a good place for us to leave off and to start taking some of your questions and hear what you were thinking. So Ange, if we can have a question, that would be great.
First, I want to just remind people to use the Q&A button to ask any questions that they have. The first question is from Richard. Richard asks, what are your thoughts about the Borat films, which use racism and sexism in the service of an anti-racist progressive message? Do the ends justify the means in this form of comedy?
Yeah, I actually just wrote a piece about Borat 2. If I may be permitted a little plug, I started a Substack account in December, so that's at charliedemers.substack.com. If anyone wants to read that piece about Borat, to make things even more complicated, I feel differently about the first Borat movie than about the second Borat movie. And then of course there was the Golden Globes this week, where Sacha Baron Cohen won the award, and and then when we won the award, the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, which is the body behind the Golden Globes, it had come out just before the awards that that body has no Black members, and so Sacha Baron Cohen said, facetiously in his acceptance speech, he said, "I want to thank the all-white Hollywood Foreign Press Association for this award." And it's such a strange joke, because it's just like, what's the joke? You're still taking the award. Like, I don't understand what it means to, like, semi-facetiously point this out about the organization, take the award, I mean, still accept all of the commercial benefits that will come from that, but just to have, and I feel like that sort of have your cake and eat it too thing is so much a part of what I think people identify as that sort of self-congratulating sort of insular Hollywood version of progressive values. I found like the response to Borat 1 was this very interesting type of panic, which was that there was this worry that it was almost like this Straussian thing of that, like that it was okay for a smaller audience, but that a larger audience couldn't be trusted with it. So there was a whole brand of essay written at the time of the first Borat movie, which was, I get it, but will they? That was sort of the thesis of the piece. And there were these pieces that said, here's Baron Cohen, who is this Jewish artist who's made this anti-Semitic character who says these horrible anti-Semitic things. We smart people know that he's doing it in order to point up anti-Semitism. But once the mouth breathers and Mountain Dew drinkers get a hold of it, it's going to be out of our hands, and we really won't be able to control it. And then in the intervening years, Sacha Baron Cohen became this kind of anti-Facebook, we really need to clamp down on speech on the internet. These tech platforms really need to stop the spread of disinformation and etc. And then he has this new movie come out where at one point he goes to a big anti-mask rally and goes up on stage and says, this virus is a hoax. It's the Wuhan flu and blah, blah, blah. And you just think, wait a minute, you're the guy who said that Facebook should be clamping down on disinformation, but like so who has the right to do a goofy prank? Is it only if you're making a movie for Amazon that you can go on stage and say this virus is a hoax because you're gonna have a wide release movie with Amazon as your chaperone? Also, what does it mean to make a movie that makes fun of anti-mask protesting, hillbillies in the backwoods of America, when you're making a movie for Amazon, this company whose workers in the tens of thousands are getting COVID, and whose workers are telling reporters that they're being forced to work in these conditions where they don't have the basic safety. So I feel like and then also just on a basic level, I thought the first Borat movie was very funny, and I really did not laugh at the second one much at all. So I think, like, in terms of the tools he uses, they're like, I'd say they're fair play in the sense of people seem to get the message from them. It seems to be clear what he's trying to accomplish with the Borat character, that's getting across. People find it funny, which is, the main way of judging whether a piece of comedy is successful. But I did feel like that there was something, one, very self-congratulatory about the second Borat movie, but two, ideologically incoherent about that one. That it was, and I think that it really draws attention to the free expression debate in a very particular way, because if you follow the logical conclusions of what Sacha Baron Cohen is saying, is essentially that the only people who should be allowed to make pranks and trickster sort of Dadaist chaotic anarchic works of comedy are those who are doing so with this sort of backing of large distributors who can guarantee that's being done for the right reasons.
Interesting. Ange, I think we are ready for another question.
Yeah, the next one is from Janet, and Janet asks, why does comedy that includes bad language cause people to find it funny?
That's a good question. I don't fucking know, man. No, it's there. So look, Tara had to cover her mouth. No, it's swear words are they're less funny as we get into a society that allows them more and more. And actually, one of the reasons why people may be leaning more into politically impermissible speech or sanctionable speech is because those are really the only taboos left. So in the way that you might drop the F word into something before, in order to give it that kind of explosive, illicit, transgressive, sort of destabilizing power, it doesn't really carry that anymore. Now, you can turn on CBC TV at 9 p.m. and hear swear words, right? So I think you can. I just remember when CTV ran The Sopranos, they didn't take the swear words out. And it's like that was this moment of like, wow, there is really nothing left to like, you know, one of the things they said that one of the things that killed Mad Magazine as like this big thing was that the first generation of kids who read Mad Magazine had to hide it under their pillow because if their mom or dad found it, they would take it away. Like it was this, you can't have Mad Magazine. That's like having dynamite in the house, right? And then all those people grew up and became parents, and they were like, I love Mad Magazine, and I can't wait till my kid is old enough to read Mad Magazine, and then takes them to the store and says, you gotta read this. This is gonna be great. And then the kid is like, who cares? Like Mad Magazine, like there's no longer anything illicit. There's no longer anything dangerous. There's no, you know, and so they're online looking at, you know, Pepe the Frog memes, right? So it's I think that swearing it in the right context, in the right moment, it can be destabilizing in a way that is jarring and surprising, in a way that makes us laugh in that kind of miniature reproduction of the tension and the release of tension.
Mm-hmm. And how about another question?
Yeah, the next one is from Ro. Organically, as a performer, does the audience need to be saved from offense? Some art is liked and some is not. Do comedians have a vulnerable spot on material that is considered?
I'm not totally sure I follow exactly the question, but if I'm I would say that there is a certain social contract that the comedian has with the audience, which ultimately is a kind of safety, but it's not the safety that is understood when people use a term like you know, when, you know, there are safe spaces, lowercase s, and then there are safe spaces, uppercase s, and the safety that's implied in comedy is that the tension will be dissipated or resolved. Like where we will leave things is that we will leave things in a place of the joke or the laugh. You know, if you go back to ancient Greece or even, you know, Shakespeare, the difference between the tragedies and the comedies, it's not just that that Shakespeare's comedies were always hilarious, it's that they ended well. And so that is, I think, part of the deal that an audience makes with a comedian, is that you will be left in a place where where it'll be funny and it'll be and so that's also one of the reasons why, you know, while I wouldn't say there's any these subjects are totally off limits, there are some subjects that will be sensibly avoided by comedians who have as yet not reached a certain skill set or haven't attained a certain level of trust with an audience. And if you're in the middle of a 45-minute club set with a room full of 120 people, and you know you're in minute 32 and they love you, you can go to places that none of them would have thought going in that night they would feel comfortable going to. And that again gets into one of the problems of the sort of internet age, is that there is no room, small dark room in minute 32 of a shared experience, because someone's always got a phone, someone's got a camera, and when that minute goes up on Twitter, it's not minute 32, it's year zero, like it's minute, it's the moment. You know, it's the context is gone.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I think there are no guarantees for either the audience or the comedian. Like there is no guarantee that you know, it's not a safe space for a comedian either, right? And I think a lot of the sort of right half of the spectrum of the conversation, which is a crude way of putting it and not completely accurate, but you know, for the sake of shorthand, you know, there is this idea that comedians should just be allowed to say whatever they want to say, and I mean, they are allowed to, but the question is, with what after effects? If people don't find it funny, they're allowed not to laugh, and if they like it, and if they dislike it enough, they're allowed to also make themselves heard. So yeah, there's a social contract between the audience and the performer, but it's not a binding one.
Great, let's go to our next question.
The next question is from Gabriel. Can the difference in standards of expected sensitivity you described, Charlie, be sustained in the social media world where context is made irrelevant?
Maybe not. That's a great question. Like I'd be lying if I said I had any answer. There's the possibility of us becoming more sophisticated as we, like, as you know, we're still only about 14, 15 years into really these technologies on a mass level, but I certainly, like, it doesn't feel that way. Like it doesn't feel like we're moving in the direction of you know, assuming an implied context that isn't there. Like most of us you know, there's this incredible historic picture. I might be getting this wrong. But there's this photo from the anti-busing riots in Boston. You know, this racist rally, and this African-American man is then attacked by members of the rally, by members of the mob. And in the photo, the famous photo of the incident, one guy is holding the man back, and it looks like he's and then in the explanations of what's actually happening in the photo, the person who's holding him was actually running in to try and get him away from these other people at the rally but what's captured in the image is, or let's put it more inspiringly, the Juan Carlos and Tommy Smith Black Power salute at the '68 Olympics. The sprinter from Australia, who's the third place medalist, is this radical leftist guy. I forget his name. Juan Carlos and Tommy Smith told him what they were going to do and asked him to participate, or if he wanted to participate. And he said, "I really think it would be more powerful if it's just the two Black athletes. I'll just, you know, stand there and you guys do the salute, and I'm supporting you." And of course, that image, what that image actually looks like and has been interpreted, is like this oblivious, you know, the like dumb white jock who's just like is completely doesn't realize that history is happening all around him, right? Like we have these split second images that we bring these stories to, that we think we understand, and are actually just these moments in time that have this total kind of subterranean context, and then have a whole context coming out of them. And comedy, needless to say, lives in those contexts, and but more than comedy lives in those places. And the social media world that we are increasingly inhabiting, it's, think back to the conversations we were having at the beginning of the pandemic about, whether you should wear masks or not, or blah, 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 these totally atomized and isolated data points. And so, in this sort of social media landscape, where people, thought they were staying informed by getting the most data possible. And actually they were getting stupider and stupider the longer they were staying in it. I'm very despairing when it comes. I'm a pretty major like social media catastrophist. I consider it like with the private automobile in terms of catastrophic human inventions, things that we will just look back and think, God, if only that hadn't happened. I really do think it's just catastrophic. And I think like any kind of, there's always people talk about the positive possibilities, and the positives are always totally hypothetical. One day we'll have this, and the negatives were like, I still don't think we've fully processed the fact that Donald Trump was the president of the United States of America. And that happened because of Twitter. Like it happened because of the 2008 crash and stuff like that too. But it would have been inconceivable without Twitter.
And also, some of the most exciting intellectuals in the world are working their ideas out in real time on Twitter as well, right? That's always happening too.
Right. I guess so. But then you have these people who like Teju Cole, I remember, was one of the first people actually doing neat stuff on Twitter, and then was like, okay, this has run its course. Like in like 2012, 2013, Coates got off of Twitter. All these people, like even people who were kind of made by Twitter, people like Lindy West, like these big sort of names who then and then I look at somebody like Thomas Chatterton Williams, who's who as he spends more and more time on Twitter, gets more and more sort of predictable in the takes or whatever. It's increasingly it's like having to do a column as opposed to being a public intellectual. I don't know. I really I'm fairly pessimistic on the social media front. But my Substack.
We'll have another question, and for the audience, we have time for another maybe 2 questions. So feel free to get those in.
Okay, the next one is from Bruce. And Bruce asks, are you at all concerned that what you're saying here today will come back to haunt you?
I hope that's not a threat. I mean, yes. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's kind of, I think I've gotten a little bit more into the space of feeling like the life that I would have to lead in order to avoid ever having the feeling or the worry about things coming back to haunt me would be worse than the life that would come from those things coming back to haunt me. So and I also just don't think I've said anything objectively objectionable, in the sense of I've said things that you could disagree with, but I really don't think I've said anything beyond the pale. And yet there's this running track in my mind, this going like, well, when you said it's better for people to, that sublimated violence is better than violence, and even though you were alluding to someone else's something someone else said, and then immediately said, I'm not sure that I agree with that because X, immediately my anxious mind goes to, someone will have the takeaway of, he said it's better for people to make aggressive jokes than to actually do aggressive things.
And I don't think anyone could take that away from what you said. And I think
I hope not, but also like what kind of way would that be to live, right? Like
well, and this is the thing that I really notice in reporting right now is this sort of running commentary that we all have in our minds at all times, and it is anxiety producing, and it is very much present in the age that we're in right now with many people across all professions. I mean, the professions that we are in absolutely depend on the ability to speak. Writing, comedy, art, journalism, these things do not exist without the ability to speak and the ability to occasionally make mistakes in that speech.
mm-hmm.
And on that note, we will take another question.
Okay, the next question is from Dax. Is there an important distinction to make between free expression and artistic freedom? Does the latter perhaps deserve more latitude?
That's a really great question.
Mm.
I have not really thought about that. My kind of immediate on the spot take would be that again is one of those subjects where the erosion of context is one of those great losses, because I feel like that's that kind of, I mean, that sort of goes back to Marcel Duchamp and the urinal in the art gallery, right? Like it, if you say to someone in a certain context, like you're going to be in a space where you're asked to engage with potentially uncomfortable ideas and which starts to sound suspiciously like a trigger warning, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I think whether or not it is a totally justifiable distinction, it's an operative one, regardless. So I think we all do bring a greater degree of latitude to artistic expression than to normal speech or normal expression. I think most of us would tend to. There are certain places where that's kind of getting eroded in certain scary ways. So, for instance, the right of an author or a creator to have characters say something that doesn't represent what they feel or say, and so to be able to have a fictional character say something objectionable. Yeah, I mostly kind of don't really want to weigh down conclusively on that question. I just sort of more want to say that I think it's a neat distinction, and I think it's I think there's that you're probably onto something.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I think that's disappeared in the social media age too is that ability to say, I don't know. Because the certainty is such a fundamental tenet of social media and of the age that we're in right now politically, and of the polarization, and the ability to stand back and say, I don't know. I want to think about that. I want to mull that over. I want to take in a lot of information and see where that lands. And I think that's such an important skill to have as a critical thinker.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one more question, Ange.
Okay, the next one is also from Dax. Many of the high-profile free expression controversies in the comedy world seem to be distinctly American. Is there a reason why Canadian comedy seems so much more risk-averse?
So that one actually does partly have like just a very prosaic technical answer, which is that there are much more established free speech precedent in the laws in Canada are much more restrictive. So, for instance, what you're allowed to say about individual people is way more restrictive in Canada, technically. There is this, this libertarian cultural streak that runs deeper in the United States, and in this case, it is not only reflected culturally, but is also reflected legally. So it's one of the things that, because this is the thing that like when the Daily Show came along, and everybody was like fake, no, fake news is now a kind of a charged term, but like the parody news show, that the United States invented, and it's like, well, actually, this hour is 22 minutes had been running for, whatever it was, over a decade before. I guess Craig, whatever his name was, before the Daily Show was really the Daily Show, was Craig Kilborn, was that his name? Anyway, but that one of the reasons that the Daily Show could be the Daily Show in a way that This Hour is 22 Minutes or the Rick Mercer Report couldn't, was that there were just legally, the Daily Show could say things about Dick Cheney and George W. Bush that you could not say on This Hour is 22 Minutes about Jean Chrétien or Paul Martin. And not, you can't say that in the sense of like, those kinds of things aren't done at the CBC. Can't say that, like, you legally can't say that. So that's that's part of it. Part of it is that more harder to pin down sort of cultural element. And then part of it is the fact that we sort of live in this weird way where we're this kind of satellite of American culture, where most of the hottest emotions in the media sphere, the sphere that Tara is talking about that lives online mostly, is all stuff that relates to American culture and American politics. So if you go on Canadian Twitter, the deepest, with the possible exception of like questions around Indigenous issues, all of the other highest pitch, highest intensity political argument is stuff that's built around American culture war stuff, American political stuff. People are tweeting from Canada, not about Aaron O'Toole, but about Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump. So I think there is just that weird effect of, we live in this kind of semi-byproduct political culture where our feelings are kind of secondhand in a way. And so it feels like we just have this sort of automatically a spectator quality to the main political event, which is, it's a weird thing, right? But we live in this physically massive country with a relatively tiny population and a gigantic, just megalopolis metropolitan world power, whose language is the same language as 2/3 or more of this country. And so, yeah.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there because we are at time. Charlie, thank you so much for thinking through all of this and being willing to do it. And I'm going to bring Jim back on. And I think
Jim walked out in disgust.
No, I didn't die.
Okay.
I'm doing my technology. I'm embarrassed to say that. I really do want to thank you, Charlie and Tara, for a really engaging conversation. And I want to thank the audience as well for attending. A video recording of this conversation will be on the CFE website tomorrow. So if you have any friends or colleagues or others in your network whom you'd like to see it, please go there and send them the link. Our next event is going to be a week tomorrow on Thursday, March 11th at 3 p.m. and it's titled Ag-Gag Laws and the Public's Right to Know. As you may know, in Ontario and Alberta, the governments have brought in so-called ag-gag laws, which seek to prevent whistleblowers, undercover journalists, and animal advocates from reporting on animal treatment, public health threats, unsafe working conditions, and environmental offenses on farms and slaughterhouses. We want to examine what does this mean for press freedom and for democratic rights in Canada. We have quite an interesting panel, eminent Toronto Star investigative journalist Rob Cribb, an expert on ag-gag laws, Jody Lazar, who is a professor of law at Dalhousie, Dick Moon, one of Canada's leading experts on freedom of expression and distinguished university professor of law at the University of Windsor. And the discussion will be moderated by Kara Zwiebel, who directs the Fundamental Freedoms Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. So if you're interested in this or any of our other upcoming events or want to see podcasts of our 25 previous events this past year, please go to our website, cfe.ryerson.ca, and have a look. Thank you again so much for joining us. Good night.